And again, departing from the coast of Tyre and Sidon, he came into the Sea of Galilee through the midst of the coast of Decapolis. And they bring unto him one that was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they beseeched him that he would put his hand upon him. And Jesus took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears. He spit and touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and saith unto him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And straightway his ears were opened, and his strings of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain. And Jesus charged them that they should tell no man. But the more he charged them, so much the more a great deal they published it. And were astonished they were beyond measure astonished, saying, He hath done all things well. He maketh both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Truly, truly, he does make the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. This is the word of God.
Appreciate the musicians and the effort they put into this every Sunday. All of Joseph and Madison and Anna and Daniel, we appreciate that very much. If your children slept in late, you can thank Gary and Kristen for that. That was all they're doing. If they have a fear of life and mortality, you can thank me for that. All right, so we are in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. And we're looking at the Gospel of Mark as the great epic of Jesus, telling the story of his purpose on this earth and his purpose throughout eternity, as we've been looking at. And one of the things that the Gospel writers have done is they've gone through and taken the different incidences, different events from the life of Jesus, particularly miracles and discussions that Jesus had with people, but miracles in those discussions. And they've tried to cast them into such a way, into such a context, or to put them together in such a way as to describe what is it exactly they saw Jesus was doing. Not what was he doing, but what was he up to? What is Jesus up to on earth? Because there was a great deal of confusion about this, not just in unbelievers. Obviously, the Jews who were expecting a Messiah, they weren't getting what they were expecting. But even Jesus' close followers were very, very confused. They had an idea. Jesus had come to earth to do something. And they thought they had a pretty good idea of what that was going to look like and what that was. And it wasn't looking anything like that at all. And rather than try to, and this is one way we can see that the Gospels are written somewhat after the ministry of Christ, even though I think that the notes of it, the rough drafts, were written all along. They were taking note of these things. They were remembering each other. They had oral tradition of it that along, but putting them together and building these Gospels, like constructing them and designing them, they wanted you, by walking along with them through the ministry of Jesus, to realize that Jesus, in some ways, was not doing anything he was supposed to do. But in other ways, he was doing far, far more than they could have possibly imagined, and in ways that were incomprehensible at the time. And so it's not just that they're trying to brag about how powerful Jesus was. That's not what the miracle recordings are all about. They're about something far deeper, far more meaningful than that. When we look at this one, for instance, and this one really is tied into the one that Mike spoke about last week, where you have the young girl who's possessed with the devil, and then you have this man who's deaf and dumb. And they really are kind of tied in together as to explicate what is the purpose of Christ and what he's actually about, what he's doing. When we look at this one particularly, we can see, I think, clearly or obviously two dimensions by which we should analyze what's happening here. A personal dimension and an eternal dimension. So let's just talk a little bit about those two dimensions and just see what it is that the gospel writers are trying to help us understand that Jesus was about. So along the personal dimensions, we have this man who has a hearing and speech impairment, and he's a real person. They're not making up stories as if they were fables to try to illustrate, right, some moral truth, as some people often will take the Gospels. That's not what they are. These are real people. These are real people with real stories, and the details are real. I don't think they're exaggerating them. I think there's good evidence throughout. The Gospels are far from an exaggeration. They're far from an embellishment. You go and read the stories, for instance, of the Caesars, what they would call in those times the Evangelions, the Gospels, right? That was what Caesar, the conquering generals, when they would conquer something, they would send out their evangelists to proclaim their gospel, and it was the epic of their life, and it was very embellished. And there's a number of friezes, a number of inscriptions throughout the old Roman Empire. We still have them, where they have these stories, what they called at that time the Gospels, and they're very embellished. The Gospels of Christ are not embellished at all. They're not exaggerated at all. If anything, they're underplaying all of these stories. They're very much underselling the story in many ways. And so these are real people, they have real problems. And Jesus was addressing these afflictions and these dysfunctions, but they deal with, and we don't know if maybe he did others, but the ones that we have record of are very serious problems. He's not doing parlor tricks. He's not healing ingrown toenails. He's not dealing with, people that have problem with, some small thing. They suffer from shyness or something. That's not what he's dealing with. He's dealing with serious issues, serious problems. And often in our time, we live living in the 21st century, we look at it, and they don't always all look so big in our minds because of modern medicine, how much it's able to do, and cochlear implants, and we have a lot of technologies that have developed, and it's not long before even artificial limbs will have full mobility. I mean, they're doing incredible things nowadays. And so we often looking at the Gospels through the lens of our modern life, they don't always look as big as they actually were. But these are serious issues. And for instance, these two here that we're dealing with, deafness and having a speech impediment, these are even big today. In fact, the 2021 Academy Award-winning movie was Coda, Children of Deaf Adults, right, is a movie. And it goes through and tries to paint a picture, portray the difficulties that exist in being hearing impaired and being a child or a loved one of someone who is hearing impaired. It's a big problem even today for anyone who's hearing impaired and anyone who loves somebody who's hearing impaired. So even today, it's a big deal. In fact, there was a piece in Gizmodo in 2012 written by a 21-year-old programmer by the name of David Peters, and he wrote an article about the difficulties he faced being deaf. He was deaf, and he was a programmer, and he writes about what the difficulties are, and he mentions three main challenges that he faced with that, and he says there's three main ones that he faced, and that's literacy, love, and solitude. And those are, some of those might not be apparently are readily obvious to all of us that they would be challenges, but he says that for the hearing impaired, these are very big challenges. For instance, literacy, you might think, well, if you're deaf, right, well, you must read a lot. Actually, the last study that was done on this says that those that have hearing impairment from 17 to 18-year-olds, their average reading level is fourth grade level. So being hearing impaired is actually connected to very poor literacy. So when you can't hear anything and you don't read much, the world gets dark and small very fast. And that brings, of course, a whole freight load of other challenges and problems. He also says that love is a real challenge. He says, and I quote, being deaf, excuse the language, but this is a quote, being deaf especially sucks when it comes to love. You can't ever love someone unless you've talked to them. He says, I've talked to people, quote unquote, normally. In other words, he had learned to speak even though he couldn't hear. He says it's hard, it's error prone, and we have to repeat a lot. There's never a good recipe for love. It's hard to have awesome conversations when you have to repeat every other thing you say and you're never sure whether the other person understood. He says, I could try to find a deaf girl. However, I don't want my kids to have an increased chance of deafness. So yeah, lots of challenges. He says, on the end of that section, I could do many other things, and I am. I exercise, I dress well, I maximize exposure, but in the end, I'm deaf. So love is very difficult when you can't hear. The biggest one he says is solitude. Deafness isolates you. You live in a world without sound, without contact. He says deafness means I don't understand anyone. When someone talks at lunch, I want to know what they say, but I miss out on the daily conversation, the back and forth, the friendships that are made. And the worst part is I don't have a choice in the matter. He says I feel like I don't have friends. When they laugh, I'm unable to understand why. It feels like a punch in the gut, a giant inside joke that I'm not part of. He says maybe I should ask them to explain the joke. Although most of the humor would be lost, but at least I would know what they're talking about. He says, I participate in conversations less than the quietest person I know. He says that some deaf people are becoming very angry at the hearing world because they go so long without feeling like they belong, without feeling loved. His conclusion to his article, and it's a much longer article you can look up, but his conclusion is, some don't think deafness is a disability, that it's just a way of life. After all, he says, we can do everything except hear. But I don't want to be a part of the deaf world. I want to be a part of the larger world. In his last sentence that I thought was very meaningful, he says, this is a cry for normalcy at a time when so many others are crying to be abnormal. So deafness in 2012 is a big problem. It's a big problem in 2021. And Jesus cared about problems. He cared that these people had very difficult life. So if that's what it is in 2012 and 2021, just try to imagine what being deaf and mute would be in the first century. There is no TV, there's no radio, there's no sign language, there's no Braille, there's no ADA for those that don't work in my profession, which is toilet paper installer. ADA means Americans with all toilet paper installers know this. ADA means Americans with Disabilities Act. It is the federal law that requires that all public facilities, all public places be accessible to all people. It's why there are ramps that you can roll wheelchairs up. There's why there's grab bars where you can get yourself onto the toilet without having the indignity of asking someone to help you. There is none of that. In fact, if you're handicapped in any way in the first century, you are a huge burden to everybody, and they would just rather you go away. Jesus cared about that. That may seem small to some of us. And by some of us, I mean all of us at some point in time. We don't really comprehend, we don't really fathom the difficulty it is for some people to live a life with disability. But Jesus cared. He always cared. He always found the time to care. And on a personal level, that is incredible. You can't imagine Again, remember, when we talk about the gospel, we think of it in terms of dear, of something kind and soft and loving. That's not what the word gospel meant originally. The gospel was the proclamation of a victorious commander who had eradicated an enemy. The Christians took the term and they reused it, they repurposed it, and made it to what it is today. Far better way of thinking of it. But here's Jesus. Everybody is convinced he's here to create a new kingdom. And all they can think of is war and death and justice, armies. And yet here's Jesus, the subject of the gospel, and every way he turns and everywhere he goes, we have records of him caring about people in this position. He's not just simply removing hindrances or challenges, he's literally saving their lives. It was a death sentence to be disabled in the first century. Lame? We think of people who are disabled today and we give them parking places right up front of every business. They threw them into some courtyard around a pool and told them every year an angel will come down and stir the waters, and if you can drag yourself down to it in time, right? No. Jesus wasn't just taking away a difficulty that they had in life, the way many disabilities today have become difficulties. Small problems in relation and relative to the life. That's why so often in the Gospels, Jesus' healings are called salvation. By faith has saved you, he tells them when he's healing them. We think, well, why is it called that? Well, he was literally saving their lives. If a person didn't have friends the way this man had friends, the way the paralytic that was lowered through the roof earlier in the story didn't have friends. If you didn't have friends who very out of character of the time were willing to sacrifice their time and their life to make sure you survived, you weren't going to survive. If you want to know what the world looked like back then, just watch Discovery Channel. And what happens when the cheetahs and the lions chase after the gazelles and there's a wounded one. That was the world back then. That's the world without Christ. Jesus came and said, that's not my kingdom. My kingdom is not going to be built on the fractured bones of the lame and the crushed heads of the deaf. My kingdom isn't leaving those people behind. In fact, my kingdom is for those people. Now that was very disconcerting to everybody. To everybody. But then there's an eternal dimension that we really should think about. We could look at the miracles of Jesus and say, wow, Jesus was so loving. Jesus was so concerned with the least, with the poorest, with the lowest. And that's all true. I'm not in any way diminishing from that. Absolutely, there is that personal dimension of the ministry of Jesus. But Jesus was not less than that, but certainly far more than that. Jesus was not here to be the social reformer. Jesus wasn't here because he was just worried about the quality of life of the deaf and the mute and the lame and the blind. And the evangelist, as they looked back on the life of Jesus and they got ready to write these gospels down, and they thought about what Jesus did and how peculiar those actions were, how strange a conquering king trying to set up a kingdom was behaving, they started to see patterns. They started to see a deeper reality than just personal concern or love, even though they obviously saw that also. We could say that what they saw was a dramatization of the great theater, the great work that God was doing. So essentially, these were props that were put in the way so Jesus could say, let me illustrate what I'm doing spiritually. And you could look at it like that, and we often do, right? We see Jesus heal a blind man, and in that healing of the blindness, we see an illustration of what it is to come to the light. In the healing of a lame person, we see what it is, right? To be healed, to not be able to walk uprightly, metaphorically speaking. And so we could look at Jesus' miracles like this one and say, he's just saying, well, here's a convenient case where I can illustrate what I'm really doing under the surface. But that's not really how the Gospels present it either. And that's not really what it is either. That would almost be kabuki theater. And that's not what Jesus was doing. The miracles that Jesus is doing are actually part and parcel. They're a foretaste of what he's doing overall. This is part of it. You cannot separate it out from the what we could call the metaphorical or the spiritual coming out of blindness and the physical. Because all of these ailments, afflictions, problems, shortcomings, they're all a product of sin. This isn't the world the way God wants it. God doesn't want a world with people who are lame or blind or deaf. God doesn't want a world with people who suffer from mental disorders. He certainly doesn't want a world where people are possessed by demons and driven to insanity. That is not the world as God envisions it. God has a elect, a predetermined, a predestined, Paul says in Ephesians 1, a predestined view of what the world is going to be. And it includes everything that us good fundamental evangelicals think of in the spiritual side. And it also includes many things that we often downplay. Over and over, we're told in prophecy that when God makes the world the way he wants it, it's going to be a world without tears and without sickness, a world without sorrow. Now, we can spiritualize those terms, but I think that's a mistake. I think that we often, as evangelicals, have settled too much for the idea that sickness is just a good thing. And it's not. And it's because we're very fearful of maybe falling into a Pentecostal approach to the Bible, a Pentecostal approach to truth. And we're trying to distance ourselves a little bit from that. And I get that because they have also characterized the gospel and they've made the gospel way too simple, where it's only about that. And if you have any sickness, well, then that somehow reflects poorly on you. And they're like the disciples who said, who sinned? Him or his parents? And they're too much like that, and that's a mistake. But the idea that this world is garbage and that all that God cares about was what's internal, that certainly is not what we find in the Gospels. We find Jesus Christ caring greatly about their spiritual beings, and we find him caring a great deal about their physical beings. And what Jesus is showing here is what the world is going to be like when things are complete. It's not at this moment that we're in right now in 2021, but it is coming. So it's important that we have a sophisticated understanding of sin and what its effects are. These illnesses are an effect of sin. Now, it may not be your individual personal sin, but this is a problem of an unsophisticated view of sin. When we think of sin as only the bad things I do, now that is sin, but that's not only what sin is. When we read Romans, we find a very different depiction of sin than just that one. That one is there too, but there's another depiction of sin in Romans. And that is that sin is like the antithesis of God. Sin is like although he doesn't use this terminology, but sin is like the Antichrist. It is just trying to establish a kingdom. And Paul talks about the reign of sin, the dominion of sin, the realm of sin, that it's something that has almost a will of its own, and it has its own machinations, and it's plotting, and it's conspiring, and it's even preempting things like the law of Moses in order to turn good things into bad. And so Paul sees this great war going on between sin as being something far more insidious, far greater, far deeper than just some things you've done wrong. Although that certainly is wrapped right up into that. And God. And between those two, you have Jesus Christ reforming, recreating, remaking all things in a new image. Now, there are some things that are of sin that are direct consequences of our actions, but not all of them are. But all things that are bad in this world, all things that are evil in this world, all things that are less than what they should be in this world are a consequence of sin. All of them are. And Jesus came to undo all of that. So the world has become possessed and blind and deaf and mute and lame, and it's become dead. And Jesus came to recreate all that, to reform it. Is where we get our word Reformation. It means to remake it, to take the raw material of what it is and make it into something different. He came to make it into something perfect. That means this world is not expendable. Jesus isn't just trying to pluck a few brands from the fire and then burn it all down. This isn't Satan's world, even though he likes to pretend it is. This is God's world, and he has every intention of redeeming it and remaking it. So, we could look at this like Jesus as a great director of a stage play. And he's going to take a very simplified script and have a private reading of the drama. And they're going to act out without costumes and without the actual audience necessarily at the moment, but he's going to act out a few of the scenes. And that's what we have in the Gospels. Where Jesus is putting into practice, he's saying, I want you to see what the world is and why it is and what it should be and how it's going to become that. And he acts that out. And he says, I'm going to take all the things that are wrong in this world. Everything from the very deep spiritual problems that us fundamental Christians are very concerned with, all the way up to those things that are not nearly as important to us. And I'm going to undo all of it. And I'm going to remake all of it. Not just blindness of the eyes, but blindness of the soul. Not just lameness of the legs, but lameness of the spirit. I'm going to undo, break it down, reform it, remake it, recreate it. And I'm not going to dispose of anyone. Doesn't matter who you are. Right? But that wasn't obvious, like I said before. That wasn't obvious even to his most devout followers. We might think Jesus healing people and doing these miracles was apropos. That's exactly what we would think he should do. But that's because we've read the end. And it's easy to be snotty, snooty, when you've read the end and then say, it's like people who watched the whole Sixth Sense and then said, I knew it all along. He was always dead. But all we have to do is look at the most devout followers of Jesus and what their thought was on what was going on, and you can probably be pretty sure that would have been yours. So think about a couple of these examples. Think of John the Baptist. He's in prison. He has been announcing his whole life a coming kingdom, a coming Messiah who's going to set everything that's wrong right. And here he is, the greatest of all the prophets, sitting in a jail in Herod's prison. That does not look like a coming kingdom. And he sends messengers to Jesus and says, "What's up, dude?" No, I'm sorry. No. He says, "What's going on? I thought you were the Messiah. Are you the Messiah or not? Are we supposed to wait for somebody else?" And Jesus answers him in his typical enigmatic way. He says, "Go tell John this. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me." And apparently that was good enough for John. But that he had already seen. You know what Jesus is telling him here? John's thinking, I'm missing something. I'm missing something. I see him healing people, and he's caring for all these. I mean, if you think about it for a moment. We have it foreshadowed in Gideon, right? But think about it. You're going to come and you're going to take on the Roman Empire, the entire world culture, and Satan and all his demons. And you're going to take away the entire world from their grip. So you're going to get together your army. And so you're going to call all the lame, the mute, the deaf, the dumb, the possessed, the insane, the women, the children. Let them come unto me. Yeah, bring the children, and we definitely need a company of children. And then we're going to say, just throw all the swords away. Get rid of those. And let's all get our war face on, right? Meek, humble, pacifists. John's looking at this saying, look, I see what he's doing, but where's the Messiah in all of this? And Jesus answers him and says, no, that is the work of God. I am the Messiah precisely because I'm doing those things. And maybe, perhaps, I don't know, it doesn't tell us, but perhaps in that moment, John gets the answer. John's mind then opens, and he remembers one of the many prophecies, for instance, Isaiah 35, where he says that God's going to come with vengeance, with recompense. He'll come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out in streams in the desert, and the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. In the habitation of dragons, where each lay, shall be grass with reeds and rushes. And this is really good. And a highway shall be there. We're from Texas. We like highways. You should like this verse. A highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men, though fools, shall not err therein. There's a whole lot of prophecies like this. This isn't the only one. And they all prophesy the same thing, that the Messiah was going to come and he was going to remake the world in ways that we couldn't imagine. And they probably thought, that's probably metaphorical. Wonder what he means by that. And then Jesus comes and he does literally that. He says, no, I'm actually going to heal the blind and the lame and the deaf and the mute. I'm actually going to do these things. And when I actually do them, then you can really rest assured that I'm actually going to make that way. Because I actually did the other things. We actually have a song that we sing from that, right? At the end of that verse, maybe you'll recognize it. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs, and everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. This is an incredible remaking of all things, and it begins with precisely the miracles that Jesus did, and it ends with an enormous, glorious reformation of the entire cosmos. Not just the material part of it that the naturalists look at, right, through their new telescopes, and they see it, and yeah, it's crazy good, and God's going to remake all of that too. But there's a dimension that the naturalists ignore. A far deeper, greater one, a spiritual dimension. It's all going to be remade, reformed, recreated. So here we have Jesus, and John is looking at this, and it's not working out the way he thought it was, because he had a different view of what the Messiah was going to be. And Jesus said, no, it actually isn't going to be the way you think. It's going to be very different. Now, you and I live 2,000 years removed. So when we read it, it all seems to make a lot of sense to us. It all resonates. We're like, absolutely. That's the way the Messiah should be. And now, the way Paul also utilizes this very argument in 2 Corinthians, right? But now, anybody comes saying they're Messiah, and they're not meek and humble and care for the least, they're immediately disqualified. Jesus set a bar, a standard so high that now everyone else is obviously false. All those old gospels of triumphant emperors and conquering generals, they sound so hollow, so weak, so pathetic. We killed thousands, and Jesus said, I healed tens of thousands. We killed, and Jesus said, I raised from the dead. We put out eyes and cut out tongues, and Jesus says, I put them back in. No wonder the Roman Empire didn't stand a chance. And these things, what we see, is not just a depiction or a metaphor of the world wrong. We actually see what's wrong in the world. The world is mute and deaf and blind. And they're not just blind spiritually, they're also blind physically. And all of those things are a real problem. And Jesus came to address them. And he came to make a new world that would be heavenly, holy, and glorifying. And that's what we see happens at the end of every one of these stories. And the way Jesus does it is meant to be deep and meaningful. And it's meant to make us really consider and think. Mark could have said there was a man who couldn't speak and he couldn't hear, and Jesus healed him. And it was wonderful, and everybody was happy. But we have these odd, idiosyncratic details. He puts his fingers in his ears, he spits, he grabs his tongue, he makes mud and puts it on his eyes. I mean, crazy things. You're thinking, he says, can you see anything now? And he's like, I see men that walk as trees. And then he does a little more, and you're thinking, what is going on? Now, they also make it very clear that none of this was because Jesus was like, having to warm up the juices to get it to work. That was, they make it very clear, right? Because there's this great time, right, when they sin for Jesus, and they say, hey, and then he sins more, and because he says, my son or my servant, is dying or sick, and then he sends another one and says, but tell him you don't have to come. I know who you are. I know what you can do. I understand authority. I'm not telling you to come. I don't need anything. Just speak the word. You just do it. And Jesus says, well, wow, all right. That's what I'm talking about. And so he just does it. So it wasn't that. But he did want us to understand some things. Jesus was not performing parlor tricks. And maybe we think when we read that, why is he spitting? How, when a naturalist or modern person reads that he's grabbing a person's tongue and shaking it, you're thinking, well, that's not why he's mute. And they're very condescending. You're missing what the connection he's trying to make, right? He's trying to draw your mind right back to Genesis, where God takes, as far as we might be able to ascertain, spits in the mud, and he makes humanity with his hands, with dirt from the ground. Can you not see Genesis when Jesus says, you don't have eyes? And he makes mud, and he puts it on there, and all of a sudden, he sees. Jesus is saying the Reformation that I'm bringing is not the Protestant Reformation. I know that's a little anachronistic example, but he's saying, I'm not coming to shake things around, to mix them up a little bit. I'm not coming to do a trick you've never seen. I'm the one that was in the beginning, and I'm here again, and I'm making the world the way we always intended it to be. And I'm going to give you a little taste of what that world is going to look like. And I'm going to be just as intimately and personally and actively involved in recreating the world as I was in creating the world. So he brings light and sound and praise out of the voids of darkness, silence, and emptiness. And if that wasn't a good enough connection when he does all that, what does Mark record? A very Genesis statement. When everyone sings, he's done all things well. How does that not put our minds right back when every time God created, it ends saying, and it was good. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He is doing an incredible thing. It's incredible for that one person. And this is why truth is such a beautiful thing, because it's so multifaceted. A lie would only be personal, or only be eternal, or only be for one and not another. But the truth is, it encompasses everything and harms nothing. So you have the personal dimension of it, which is every bit true and meaningful and important. And then that just gives way, the way the dawn gives way to a bright sun. It gives way to the eternal dimension, in which Jesus Christ is saying, yes, I'm healing a person, but I'm recreating the world. I'm recreating the entire essence of things, the entire culture. Everything is going to change. Nothing will ever be the same again. And it hasn't been. You and I take the world we live in for granted. We should be much more in awe. The world we live in right now, with all its imperfections still, God's not done yet with it. But even with all its yet imperfections, it is an incredible work of Jesus Christ. You don't live in the desperation, the despair that this mute, deaf man lived in every day. And that's all because of Christ. And then when we start digging in and realizing that not only was a metaphorical representation of the spiritual work he's doing, but it was actually just like the point of the spear, and that runs so deep, deep, deep down into every spiritual fiber of the entire existence of all of God's creation. He was correcting something, not just at the very end. He wasn't just walking around playing whack-a-mole with the symptoms of sin. Jesus portrays it in this way in one of his parables. He says that he went in and took away all the things that the strong man trusted in. And then he bound them hand and foot. And then he let out all those that he had taken captive. That's what Jesus is doing. He's not just flexing his spiritual muscles. Watch what I can do. He is systematically, deliberately undoing, dismembering the kingdom of the devil taking back what Satan thought he had conquered, liberating, while he's doing it, everyone that Satan had overcome. And all at the same time underneath, creating an entire new world out of the old one. I think we should all be able to say together, he's done all things well. Dear Father, we are grateful for your word. We're grateful that you have challenged us with it, that you speak to us. Help us to hear your voice in it and not ours reading back into it. Help us to be sensitive to what you're saying. Father, help us to be humble, to acknowledge that there's so much depth in it that we don't comprehend, that we haven't fully paid attention to, that we haven't fully understood, and that it means so much, and that it's our duty to, and our pleasure to plumb its depths, to understand what really happened then and what has happened now in our lives, and that what will happen. We thank you and praise you and confess you do all things well in the name of Jesus. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next week.